I'm Cash Delahunty. My full name is Joseph Cash Delahunty. I was born in Perth, West Australia, and migrated to the United States in 1939. This is my wife, Marjorie, and I met her during our high school years. The difference is that she was going to Ogden High and I was going to Cypress High. So there's about 40 miles between where she lived and I lived. But I met Marjorie by her cousin. So we started to drive around the area, and we talked to several people that had lots for sale. But I had one person tell me that I ought to go talk to a man by the name of Elgin Graff, who lived in Santa Clara. So I got his address and I went up and knocked on the door, and a big voice says, "Come in." So I walked in, and Elgin was laying on the couch, and he had just had knee surgery. He was recuperating from knee surgery. He wasn't really expecting a stranger, so he seen me come in and he sat up in a hurry, and I told him who I was, and I said, "You wouldn't happen to have a building lot that you would sell me, would you?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "I got something I'll sell you." So he came out and got in the car with me, and we went over to what they call the Black Ridge over there on the east side of Santa Clara. And we went down Arrowhead, and he had some acreage just down below there. And he had an acre and a half. We worked out a deal, and Omar done all of the sub work, like putting the sewer and water lines in there, and the street and the curb and the gutter. And by that time, my sons had grown up where they were old enough that they took care of the business up here. And I started spending my time down in Santa Clara. I had a little motor home that I parked on the lot down there, and worked out of that. And I would go down maybe for a week or 2 weeks at a time, and then come home and spend some time home with Marjorie, and then go back and work. And I had just finished my second house, and Omar came over to visit me, and I took him through the house and showed him what we had done, and he was impressed with it. He said he liked it very, very much. Well, in 3 or 4 days later, Omar come back and he asked me, he said, "Would you be interested in building a house for my mother and father?" And I said, "Well, I've got 7 lots here left to build." And he said, "Well," he said, "they're really in a bad way." He said their house burned down, and they're living in a trailer house out on their property. And he said, "We've just got to get Mom and Dad into a permanent residence." And he said, "I think you do us a good job." And I said, "Well," I said, "I'd be willing to give it a go." And he said, "Fine." He said, "I'll pick you up Sunday after church." Omar was a counselor in the bishopric at the time. he said, I'll pick you up after church, and he said, we'll go out to the folks' place and introduce you and let you see what we've got and what needs to be done. So he did. Omar and Kay Jean picked me up, and they took me up to Enterprise, which wasn't surprising. I mean, you know, that didn't bother me too much. Then they turned west and started driving out west across. After we got out of Enterprise, why, I thought, wow, where's this guy taking me? We drove until we came to the turnoff where you went over to Hoseka over there. I mean, where you went down, and they turned left up down the canyon. Then they still drove a heck of a long ways down the canyon. And finally we wound up on the Mathews ranch. And the first thing I seen was a grave there with a pair of boots sticking out of it. And I said, what's that all about? And he said, well, he said, Dad doesn't like trespassers. And he says, they shot that one and buried him there. Yeah. So I thought, well, I'm in it now. Let's see what's going to happen. So we went down to the trailer house down there, and I met Ross and Orma and your dad Paul. And Paul was sitting in the trailer house down there eating a cob of corn. And I talked to Ross and Orma, and I asked them, I said, what have you got for plans? Well, Ross gave me an epileptic that I won't repeat. And he says, we don't have any plans. He said, I've got a granddaughter that works for an architect. And he said, they've drawn me a picture. And he said, it looks like a big glass boat, and I don't want nothing to do with it. So I said, well, we got to have some plans to go from. And I said, if you'll give me a week, I said, I'll go back up to Salt Lake and I'll talk to some of my contacts up there and come up with a set of plans that may suit you. So I had a draftsman that I knew up here. Pettit was their name. And I had him draw me some plans and a rough sketch of what they thought would be a nice country home, so to speak. I took the plans back down. Of course, I didn't know anyway how to get back to where the house was. I mean, it was just all total wilderness to me. So Omar took me back out. And I showed the plans to Ross and Orma. And Lester, that was the man's first name, Lester Pettit, had drawn the house as it is. The porch all the way around, the back door facing west, and the front of the house was facing north. Ross said, I want the house to look north. And he and Orma just loved the way it was built. And they said, well, what about heat in the house. And I said, well, you don't have gas out here, so you're going to have to really rely on a wood-burning stove. And they said, well, that's what we're used to. But there was one change that Ross wanted, and that was he wanted a private door that he could get into the bedroom without having to come through the house. Ross was a very private person. It was hard to get to know him. And if I would speak to him, he'd take and give me about 2 or 3 words, and that was about the length of the conversation. So I went to my subcontractors that I had been using over in Santa Clara, and I told them, I said, I've got a job that I'm doing out in the beaver dams. I said, would you be interested in coming out there to take and do the electrical and the sheetrock and the framing and things like that? And every one of the subcontractors said, yeah, we'll come out to the beaver dams. And of course, Ramon, I met him out there. And in fact, I'd met Ramon and Paul and Omar when they put in my subdivision, because they're the ones that actually did the work. And Ramon had the backhoe out there, and we staked out the footings where they had to be. And he had the track hoe there and was digging the footings. Now I had to go over to Lincoln County, and I think the name of the town was Lincoln itself, to get the building permit. Why, I don't know. It was miles from civilization. But Omar felt he wanted to have a building permit, so I went over and took out the building permit in Lincoln. And we got approval. And Ramon started to digging the footings. Well, on that knoll, or that crest where the house stands, is solid rock. And the river, when it would flood, would come down there and hit that point and turn out and go on down. So Ross says, I want the house built right where the old one was that burned down. He said, because when we get a flood down here, it's not going to take the house. I just made some friends down there that are lifelong friends that I'll never forget. And I would go down at least once or twice a year, spend a few days down there with Ramon and doing things. And when Paul called me up and said that Ramon had had a stroke and was not doing well, that was heartbreaking. And I told Paul, I said, well, I'm coming down. I want to see Ramon. And he says he can't talk to you. But I said, I'll be there, and I'm going to be down around such and such a time. I got to the hospital, and Paul and Valois were sitting in front by the elevators when I came up. And he said, now, Ramon we thought he was doing better, but he's not. And I said, well, what would you like to do? He said, well, I'd like to give him a blessing. And I said, do you want to put him in the Lord's hands? I said, do you want the Lord's will to be done? And he and Valois said yes. Of course, Orma had already passed. No. Yes. Ross passed away first, then Orma, and then Ramon. So both Ross and Orma had passed. And my son was with me, and Paul. So Ramon got his compressor and drill out, and in that rock that was there, he drilled holes, and then he put a small charge of dynamite down there. Then he poured some fertilizer on top of that, and then he poured some diesel fuel on it. Oh, he must have drilled about 10 or 15 holes. Then he got the track hoe, and he scooped up some dirt and piled it on top of that. And he said, that'll deaden the blast. He said it'll just be a puffing. Now, Valois' husband, I've forgotten his name. What was his name?
Robert. Bob.
Robert.
Bob is what most people call him. Bob Hansberry.
Was it Hainsworth?
Hansberry.
Hansberry, yeah. Bob Hansberry and Valois were there, all lined up in a row with the chairs there. And Ramon says, okay, here it goes. And it went all right. It blew rock 50 feet in the air. Bob Hansberry tipped over backwards. But anyway, Ramon softened the rock.
Good job, Devin.
Yeah. I'll never forget that. Bob's feet just went up in the air and the chair went over and he was right on his back. But anyway, then a man by the name of Thompson, I can't think of his first name now.
Ron Thompson.
Yeah, it was a concrete man.
Oh.
And he got the cement trucks out there, and they would bring 9 yards of rock at a time, and we dug the footings, and Paul screened a lot of fill, and Aaron and I leveled it out so that it was perfectly level. And we poured the floor and the footings in one pour, which we call a monolithic pour. Now, the inspector, we told him when we were going to pour, and he didn't show up, so I just took pictures of the rebar and stuff that was in there. And they had about 3 or 4 cement trucks come out, and they would mix it at the batch right there on Sunset Boulevard and the one that goes down through St. George and Bluff, yeah. The batch plant was there, and they would put a chemical in the cement that would stop it from being active. And then before they got to the job site, they'd add another chemical to it that would bring the concrete back to life. And they bring it in at 9-yard loads. Now, those front-end loaders on those trucks, when they'd come down those steep, would pour concrete out the front of the truck in front of them. So anyway, we got that pour made, And they'd had Goff Plumbing come out prior to pouring that to take and put the underground plumbing in so that it was in place when the concrete was poured. And the framer came out, and my goodness, I can't think of his name now, but he was raised up in that little town north there. I told you what it was, but now Enterprise. Yeah, he was raised in Enterprise, and he done the framing, and by this time I had got to know Ross a little bit better. I would take Marjorie would do some cooking for me, and I'd take some of it over and I'd eat supper over with Ross and Norma. And Ross started to warm up and become friendly. And he come out one day and he said, "Cash," he said, "you know, I think you're going to get me a house built." And I said, "Well, we're sure working on it." And I went over there one evening to, and what I'm going to tell you now, you can't tell anybody else.
You better cut it.
But anyway, we were sitting there, and he looked at me and he says, "Do you want to go fishing?" I said, "Sure, I'd like to go fishing." So, okay. So he went into the bedroom back where they were sleeping there and come out with a rifle. And so we drove up through the fields up there in the west field that they call it, up above the house. And he said, "See those lights up there?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "That's a big fish." He says, "You get it." So we got a 2-point fish out of that deal. So we took it down to where Bud's trailer was, and Bud had a hoist down there, and we dressed that fish out down there. And I said, "Well, what are we going to do with all of these entrails and stuff?" And he says, "Oh, don't worry, they'll be gone in the morning." Anyway, the rope broke and dropped our fish down on the ground. Well, Ross said a few choice words. Yeah. Anyway, when Ramon and Paul came out Saturday, they spent all day with the hand grinder. We ground it all up into hamburger, and it was quite a picnic, I'll tell you. And then Ross would like to drive up and down the ranch from one end to the other. And if there's anything he didn't like woodpeckers, and he didn't like squirrels. So I think we shot more woodpeckers down there that year than Carter has pills. Every day that the house was under construction, about 10 or 11 o'clock, Ross would walk up the hill to the shop. And he'd stay up there for 2 or 3 hours, whatever he was doing. I don't know, I was busy, but he'd go up there, and I'd go up there and see if he was all right, and he'd in there doing things, and he looked at the shop and he says, "You know," he says, "that damn Ramon, if he doesn't straighten this shop out," he said, "he's going to get in trouble." So, but Ross was a true friend, and I think he accepted me as a friend. And Orma was always gracious, always. Well, Ross was cramped in that trailer house down there. He hated it. Now, I can't think of the gentleman's name, but he had an automobile dealership in St. George. And one day he showed up at the ranch and he had a bedstead. And he set it up in the bedroom where Ross and Orma were. And the studs were up, but there was no sheetrock on it. And we had brought that little wood-burning stove from their house in St. George out there and put it up in that back bedroom. And from that day on, Ross moved out of the trailer into the house. So he'd light the fire. That was the only heat that was in the house, and it was getting pretty far down into the fall by then, because I don't think we started until September, October. Maybe it was in October, November, September we started. And the sheetrockers came out and they put the sheetrock on. The electrician Larson that lived right next to my subdivision down there was an electrician, and he came out and done the electrical work. The rock mason came out. Orma wanted a rock fireplace. And Omar was a little bit upset about that. He wanted to put a brick fireplace up there, but Orma wanted rocks, so that was fine. And the rock mason came out and built the rock platform for the stove to sit on, and then the chimney. Now, in that rock platform, they put a lot of their artifacts in there that they had gathered over the years, such as their a matata and things like that the Indians used, and they're in that fireplace if you look for them. And we were getting pretty far along then. I brought the cabinets down. They made them up here in Salt Lake, and I took them down. David helped me hang them. And then I done the Formica work on the cabinets and put the tile down underneath the stove there, and put the tile around the showers, painted it, put all the finish work in there. We covered the outside of the house with tar paper. And it was December when that was done. And there was a storm brewing. And Ross said, he said, "You've just got to get out of here." He said, "You're going to be snowed in." And I said, "But I've got things to do." And he says, "Unless you want to spend the winter with us, get out of here." So I had another man with me at the time, and we had got the carpet laid, and everything was painted. Some of the toilets weren't hooked up, but Paul and Ramon done that. And When I got up to the goosenecks up there, it was snowing pretty hard, but the road was still passable to drive up there. So I drove up over there, and the other fellow was driving my pickup truck. By the time I got up on top, headed for Enterprise, my windshield wipers couldn't keep the snow off the windshield. It was coming down so hard. Well, I got over to Cedar City, and the police had blocked the road. They wouldn't let you travel the road. It was so bad. It was coming from the north, blowing to the south. And I said, well, I've got a man somewhere ahead of me. And I said, I'm sure he's got over to Beaver. And I said, I really got to make sure that he's all right. So they said, well, we'll let you through, but you're not to go any further than Beaver. So I drove on over to Beaver and found my helper in the hospital over there, sitting in the waiting room. Just that's as far as he got. So we both bedded down in the mobile home, and in the morning it had stopped snowing, but the roads were just very treacherous. But I thought, how in the world am I going to get supplies and material out here? What's going to happen? But everybody that I worked with was more than willing to come out. And without their help, it just wouldn't have got done. Well, I became very close to Omar. He done a magnificent job in doing that subdivision for me. And I just came very close to Omar. He fixed up his basement for his mother, and I done the floor covering work down there, and I put a floor in upstairs for he and anyway, and I would spend a lot of time just visiting with Omar, and it's when he asked me if I'd consider building a house for his mom and dad that it just shocked me that he'd want me to do that. And I had never met Ross. I had seen him when he would come in. They'd stay over at Omar's, and I'd seen Ross, but he wouldn't speak to me. He was very reclusive, so to speak. Orma was very cordial all the time, but I got to know Ross, and I count him as a true friend, and I think he counted me as a friend. I would come down there and he'd tell me, now he enjoyed the big windows in the house. I guess the old house had small windows. I never saw that before it burned down. And if you once sat in a chair, you couldn't look out the windows and see what was going on around you. But when we put those big windows in, Ross could sit there and he could look out over the pond and up to the shop. And he's telling me, he said, I was sitting here the other day, and he said, and I don't know who, I guess it was Paul or Omar, found some goldfish and they brought them out there and put them in the pond. Well, they multiplied like grapes. And they were getting up, some of them pretty big. And Ross was telling me, he said, I was sitting here, and he says, you know, he said, I seen an eagle drop down, grab a goldfish, and fly off with it. He said, I wished he'd do it more often. Then he'd like to sit out on the front porch and shoot bullfrogs down in the pond. Those things that make such a racket at night, it's a wonder anybody could sleep. So he'd sit up there with these .22 and he'd see a bullfrog down there, and that was a dead frog, I'll tell you. I think he cleaned them all out.